All right, well, welcome everyone, and especially welcome to our hometown. If you haven't noticed, if you walk outside the tall building with the big red thing on the top, that's our headquarters. This is the only time of the year I actually get to do a keynote and sleep in my own bed the night before. So we appreciate all of you who've come in. The weather's always like this. It never gets too hot here. So if you're thinking about a great place to open an office, we have great talent. Please come here. I also sit on the Economic Development Board of North Carolina, so I can check that box as well. Look, I only have a few minutes this morning, and I'm very, very passionate about the topic I would like to talk about. So I am going to dive in and do my best to hit my SLA, but just warning the organizers here, I'm from the airline business, and within 15 minutes is on time. So what I'd like to do, I'm going to spend a couple minutes on software technology, but really it's more to set the stage to talk about something I'm very, very passionate about, and that's the potential for a different way of working, which I think kind of we can broadly put under the banner of open, has an opportunity to fundamentally, truly change the world that we live in, and certainly change the world for our children and our children's children. But let me start with just a couple of pages of history. 25 years ago, Linux began. We had a big celebration actually this summer, August, I think it was 25th, it was when Linux, kind of the official start date with Linus and Linux. And if you go back to that period of time, I don't think anybody necessarily thought this was starting a movement or a different way of working. I think it was a bunch of geeks getting together and wanting to build an operating system that would work on a 8286 chip, right? And so, but over time, as that worked and built, a couple things happened. A phenomenal technology called Linux, as well as a very kind of different way to work. And over that period of time, it really started off as a bit of a hacker movement, and it continued to grow and grow and grow. And Red Hat was a part of this from the very, very early days. And it went from being kind of a hacker movement to truly kind of what I'll say a viable alternative for traditional software. That was a role that Red Hat really worked hard to play. It's like, how do we make this a viable alternative to other kind of enterprise software to be able to run mission-critical applications, et cetera, et cetera. And for a long time, we were kind of under the radar. And if you go into any Red Hat office, we have quotes, literally, I think it's in every Red Hat office. It's a Gandhi quote that says, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And look, I don't want to call this a fight, though his predecessor did call Linux a cancer. We're very good friends with Microsoft now. They're a good partner, so I don't mean to put this up there. But over the last several years, we have gone from that position that I said about being a viable alternative and showing that open source can be a viable alternative to traditional software to being the default choice for a next generation of infrastructure. If you look at cloud and cloud architectures, virtually entirely built on open source platforms. If you look at virtually any new language framework, entirely built on open source platforms. If you look at something like big data, it's hard to come up with something that's not open source or any innovation in big data that's not open source, right? So we really have gone from a place where it was a viable alternative, and Red Hat, I think, played a key role in that, and stock exchanges and nuclear submarines running Linux, to now we don't have the same conversations, right? We're not having conversations about, ooh, can this do as well as Unix? Now it's much more about, well, of course our next generation is going to be open source. Let's talk about how we consume it and how we actually drive value for that and still be able to consume it safely. So it's a fundamental leap change in where we were from a hacker movement to something that really is driving the pace of innovation and technology. It's really even gotten to the point where companies are competing around communities. One of the most fascinating areas that I've been watching that, frankly, Red Hat doesn't directly play in is machine learning, right? If you look at Google, Microsoft, Facebook, they've all open sourced their machine learning engines. Why? because they recognize the company that builds the community around that piece of technology, that technology is going to win. And by being an active participant leader in that community, there's going to be economic benefit. Now, exactly what that is when you've given it away, I think they still don't know, but I think they recognize it's there. They understand that. So now you have companies actively trying to get people to adopt their technologies. And I think that is a leap change from where we were just a few years ago. And again, I think it shows that there's a growing recognition that the best way to innovate in these very fundamental areas is to do it in the open, and there's huge value in those communities. Now, that's briefly on software, but I would argue the value of not the software technology, but the way you work in the open to innovate has significant benefit beyond software. And this is a place I'm particularly passionate. If you look at where we are in the development of our economy, this is kind of globally, we had a period of time that we all call the Industrial Revolution, that from 1870 to 1970, our output per person grew at roughly 3% a year. And if you do the math on that, that means that our output per person, or our well-being, doubled every 30 years. It was a phenomenal time. We all, it's this iconic era for industrialized economies where people continued to feel better off. People felt like their children were better off. And we've made enormous, enormous advances. But around the 1980s, it started to slow down, right? And one of the biggest issues that you hear over and over again from economists, and now, by the way, clearly bubbling out into the political arena, is a frustration that people do not feel better off than they were 10 years ago, and a fear that their children will not be better off than they are. And that just comes down to the fact that our productivity growth, right, our output per person, our measures of productivity are hardly moving at all, right? Since the 80s, we've had very, very, very little improvement in output per person. Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, once wrote that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything, right? If we want to continue to develop and increase the well-being of society, we have got to figure out how to restart productivity growth. And I would argue a big, big chunk of the reason it has slowed down is because the nature of what we've done as collective people and institutions, whether that's government, whether that's education, whether that's businesses, has really come down, if you want to reduce it very, very simply, the value that businesses create is getting a lot of people working together to make more units of production than they could each produce individually. It's economies of scale, right? We've learned that getting people coordinated, working together, can create more output as a collection of people than we could as a bunch of individuals working individually. We're reaching diminishing marginal returns in that area. Our ability to double production of vehicles, it's unclear we can do that and not kind of burn ourselves with global warming, but our need for more stuff is starting to decline relative to the value of how we use things more efficiently and effectively. And so we need to find a way to jumpstart production, but recognizing that's not any longer about how I proscribe how people do things and getting people to do things more efficiently. We've reached kind of a declining marginal return there. The trick, I would actually argue, going forward for our economies is understanding how do we get people working together to be able to innovate more? How do we get the collection of people working together to generate better ideas than people individually working on their own? Now, in an IT context, we often talk about a different way to innovate, a different model to innovate that's much less about planning and proscribing and much more about trying, experimenting, learning, and adjusting is, Agile and DevOps. And I know there's going to be a lot of discussion about Agile and DevOps today. I'm not here to talk about that. But what I'm here to talk for a few minutes about is those same principles need to be applied not just to how we develop our scale-out systems of engagement, but more broadly, how do we leverage these principles for institutions to be able to innovate at a faster rate. I hear this over and over again, and if you want to be a consultant, so Jonah, you should add this to your portfolio, just say the word digital disruption and CEOs will write you a check. No, in all seriousness, you hear this term digital disruption, and I have an opportunity to talk to a lot of CEOs, and what you hear over and over again is, oh my God, I'm worried I'm going to get disrupted, and my organization is not built to change, it is not built to innovate. And you think about that, it's almost obvious when you put it this way, right? How many people says, I have a thorny problem, let me go get some bureaucracy to solve that, right? That doesn't happen. We know that bureaucracies, hierarchies are really good at driving efficiency, they're not good at innovating. But when we're in a world now where, I'll flip the slide, I'm going to go actually a couple forward here, to self-driving cars, what is more valuable? Taking a car that in the United States is used 90 minutes a day and figuring out how to use that 3 or 4 hours a day via autonomous driving, via ride sharing, via a better kind of understanding of traffic patterns, or building the car 5% more cheaply, right? Automakers recognize this now, right? Their organizations are built to build a car 5% more cheaply, but that is becoming irrelevant in a world of things like self-driving cars. Now, the problem is, and I hear this over and over again, this is really, really, really hard. So I was actually talking to the CEO of one of the big 3 automakers, and they're sitting there saying, well, we're being disrupted by Uber. How could I ever understand that was going to happen, and how do I construct an organization that can react to that, right? That's the problem when we think about being open. The traditional hierarchies are very, very, very good at driving efficiency in a static environment. We don't live in a static environment, and so many of the problems we have now are less about building stuff and proscribing and much more about how do we come up with creative solutions to problems. But how do you do that? And the reason this is such a difficult problem is I would actually argue that so much of what's made institutions successful in the past at this size and scale, the ability to plan well, the ability to be able to proscribe and hold people accountable and drive an execution agenda, those very skills actually work against you in a world of, well, how do I innovate and how do I innovate at scale? So I'd actually argue the challenge when we think about all things open really does come down to, first off, the leadership challenge. What does it mean for leaders to try to build more open organizations at scale that are capable of innovating, right? So we know we can get a group of people in a room and brainstorm a problem, but now how do you do that at 2,000 people? How do you do it at 5,000? How do you do it at 10,000? How do you do it at 50,000 people, right? How are you building an organization capable of doing that? And as a leader, again, what's your role, right? Your role is to get the collection of people to do more than they could individually, right? So the synergy is how do you actually get better answers out of that group of people than you get out of individuals? It's not just about leadership. It's also about people and how they participate. I'll put a shameless plug into open source videos. So we have a video series that talk about using open source in areas primarily outside of technology. And we had one that we first, if you Google open source videos, you'll find them. They're phenomenal videos. We premiered one this year at the summit this summer, at the Red Hat Summit this summer, that was about patients and patients participating in their own care. And the thing that's so striking to me in that video isn't the fact that those patients are better off because they participated in their care, but because they participated and because they share, other patients are better off because of their participation, right? So it isn't just about leaders figuring out, okay, well, how do I construct an organization to do this? It's all of us thinking about how do we participate in these new communities to make not only ourselves better off, but the communities better off, and therefore, more broadly, society better off. Huge, huge challenge there as well. Red Hat has a mission statement, and our mission statement is to be the catalyst in communities of contributors, customers, and partners, building better technology the open source way. And the creation of that mission statement was one of the kind of biggest learning experiences I had, because when we did this, like everything at Red Hat, we did it participative bottom up. And the first draft of our mission statement said, to be the leader in communities of contributors, partners, blah, 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 blah. And a number of our developers who work on Linux and other key open source communities say, well, that's not right. We're not leaders. We don't have any fiat. We don't have any power. Leader's the wrong word. So we went back and we did a second draft to be an active participant in communities of ... Same people said, well, that's not right because we're trying to drive the direction of these communities. We do more than just participate. I was like, well, are we leading the thing or are we participating in this thing, right? I was very black and white, right? I came from an airline. And finally, someone came up with the term, well, catalyst, right? Because we are there and because of our contributions, we can influence direction. It's not because we lead. It's not because we can lead by fiat. It's because we can influence direction via our contributions. And so we use the word catalyst as we think about the role that we need to play to drive direction of communities, right? It's not about necessarily being a leader, but no one can be a passive follower either. So what's next? I would actually argue if we look at the biggest kind of social problems that are confronting us today, global warming, curing things like, diseases like cancer, dealing with things like water and other scarce resources. These are huge, daunting problems. And the one thing I'm sure of, there's no one company, there's no one government, there's no one institution that will be able to solve these problems, right? When we start thinking about the size and scale of the problems that are in front of us, recognizing the need to build broad communities, recognizing the principles around collaboration and transparency and how we build communities will be critical for us to address these problems in the 21st century. Getting this right, truly figuring out how we can get better solutions out of us working together than we can do individually will determine whether we solve this productivity trap, which will be a significant issue as we think about the politics that develop in a world where we don't have productivity growth, but also to solve the world's largest issues. A lot of people, when they think about open source, think about crowdsourcing, right? And how do you get great ideas out of crowds? Open source is not crowdsourcing. Yes, it's great to have a lot of people participating, but I just want to come back to the last point again. It's about how do you get better ideas by getting people to work together than the sum of the ideas that individuals can create working apart. That's the power of open. That's the power of open source, and that's an area we still need a lot of work to do. Jonah and I have had great conversations on this. We're both working on this. We don't have all the answers, but I'm at least confident that by leveraging open communities, we'll ultimately be able to find the answers to how we actually work better together to solve these problems. So hopefully this week will be a great opportunity to start to make progress in some of those areas, and I hope you all plan to be active participants and catalysts here this week. Thank you.